After we hear from our distinguished panelists, there will be an opportunity for Q&A. If you wish to submit a question, you can use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to submit your question. Today's event is part of ADL New York, New Jersey's Take Action series, where we provide insight into ADL's work and tangible action items for joining our fight against hate. At the end of the event, we will show you how to make your voice heard in Congress by submitting a letter to your local representative, encouraging them to take a stand against extremism. With that, I will pass it over to our Regional Director, Scott Richman, to start us off.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Good afternoon and welcome to today's very important conversation about extremism. As Hannah said, my name is Scott Richman and I'm honored to serve as the director of ADL's New York, New Jersey regional office. I will be co-moderating today's discussion along with my friend, the extraordinary head of the New York Board of Rabbis, Rabbi Joseph Potasnik, whom I thank for co-sponsoring this event. ADL's purpose in hosting this event, this conversation, is not only to understand where our nation stands on the issue of domestic extremism 6 weeks after extremists attacked the Capitol building, but also to learn what can be done to prevent this from happening again. We each have a role to play in ensuring that there is action on this issue. That is how ADL has approached the issue of hate since our founding in 1913, with both an understanding of the facts and decisive action. And specifically in the area of extremism, this could not be more clear. Our Center on Extremism has been monitoring this across the ideological spectrum for decades. Our staff of experts strategically monitors, exposes, and disrupts extremist threats on the internet and on the ground. They also have resources, expertise, and trainings that enable law enforcement officers, public officials, and community leaders, as well as internet and technology companies, to identify and counter emerging threats. Today's panel will reflect ADL's commitment to fighting extremism on all sides, and I'm very pleased to welcome Congressman Tom Malinowski, with whom ADL has worked for years on these issues, Congressman Ritchie Torres, our new partner in this critical work, and my esteemed ADL colleague, Carmiel Arbit. After these brief introductory remarks, we will engage in a moderated discussion with the three of them, followed by time for questions and answers from those tuning in. As Hannah said, we can put in the chat now, actually, the links to the bios of all three panelists, but I do want to briefly introduce them. Since 2018, Congressman Tom Malinowski has served the 7th Congressional District of the state of New Jersey. He is Vice Chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and sits on the Homeland Security and Transportation Committees. He previously served as the Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor in the Obama administration, as well as serving as Senior Director for the National Security Council under President Clinton, and Chief Advocate for Human Rights Watch. He was born in communist Poland during the height of the Cold War. He and his mother fled to the United States when he was 6. Representative Ritchie Torres was recently elected to serve the 15th Congressional District of New York. He is a member of the Financial Services Committee and Vice Chair of the Committee on Homeland Security. In 2013, at the age of 25, Congressman Torres became New York City's youngest elected official and the first openly LGBTQ person elected to office in the Bronx as a member of the City Council. In that role, he passed over 40 pieces of legislation, including legislation protecting the city's affordable housing stock and tackling the city's opioid epidemic. Congressman Torres and his siblings were raised in a public housing project by a single mother. And Carmiel Arbit is ADL's Director of Government Relations. Her work focuses on driving government relations strategies to help combat domestic extremism and anti-Semitism. She is also a non-resident senior fellow for Mideast programs at the Atlantic Council, a co-founder of Key Bridge Strategies. She has consulted for nonprofit organizations around the world, advancing public diplomacy, government relations, and community engagement on 4 continents. She has previously served as the Director of Strategic Engagement at AIPAC's Office of Policy and Government Affairs in Washington, and she worked at the Brookings Institution Center for Middle East Policy, focusing on counterterrorism. Like I said, we have a very special panel today, and before we get to that discussion, just a few words about why we chose the eve of the Jewish holiday of Purim to host this call to action. And for that, I'm going to ask my co-host, Rabbi Joseph Potasnik, to offer some remarks.
Thank you so much, Scott. It's always a pleasure to be with you. And as a friend of your family, that pleasure is even enhanced. And we in New York are great devotees of Congressman Ritchie Torres. And by extension, Congressman Malinowski. We say New York that the light at the end of the tunnel is New Jersey. So it's nice to have you with us as well. Let me say it's interesting that there are two words in the English language that are spelled with the exact same letters and are totally opposite in meaning. They are united and untied. The only difference is where you place the letter I. And I think that in this battle against extremism, that message is very important. We can't do this as the I. We have to do this as the we. It's interesting. I remember years ago when we used to have paper tickets to go to an event, it would say very clearly, no good if detached. And all of us, I think, are realizing that we need to fight this, not detached from one another, but connected to one another. On Purim, we have this custom of sending packages of food to our friends, to members of the community, to the poor, because it was Haman, who I think was a domestic terrorist. If you look at Haman, he was a domestic terrorist. And we sent the packages to one another because we say, contrary to what he said, that we belong to each other. He said, no, the people are all dispersed. It's easy to destroy them. And we're saying, no, we're not all dispersed. We are very close to one another. And the second thing is, in Purim, we have to make some noise when the name of Haman is read. You can't close your eyes because you never see tears if you close your eyes. You have to make noise, especially when that evil name, that evil representation is recited. So let me just conclude by saying in Ritchie Torres's native Yiddish, there is an expression which is Menschlichkeit is mehr von alles. Decency matters more than anything else. And I think when we learn to stand together in this battle, decency will triumph. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. So we're going to start, and I'm going to turn to you, Congressman Malinowski, with the first question. The rise of extremism has been a growing problem for years, and the polarized environment of the past few years has really only exacerbated this problem. But I am not sure that your average American was attuned to just how bad the situation had become. That all changed on the afternoon of January 6th, when it was on full display for the American people at the Capitol, the heart of our nation's democracy. And I want to start by asking you, Congressman Malinowski, about your personal experience that day. Where were you? How did that day unfold for you? And how did you process these events, given your years of fighting against extremists?
Thank you, Scott. And I also want to thank Rabbi Potasnik for his strong endorsement of the Hudson River Tunnel just a moment ago. New York and especially New Jersey need to see the light at the end of that tunnel. So on that day, I was in the House Gallery, which is the balcony section of the House chamber. We were all spread out because of COVID. I was there to watch what I expected to be an interesting and historic but ceremonial transfer of power, a peaceful transfer of power, which is what we have had traditionally in the United States. Of course, we knew that there were crowds massing outside. I remember stepping out the window to look out the window a few times, and it looked very serious. But I have to say, I was pretty confident that the House was a fortress, that we had security beyond that which members like Ritchie and I see every day, and that the things would be fine. And of course, they weren't. At a certain point, there was chaos, there was confusion. The speaker, you've probably seen this video, Speaker Pelosi was pulled off the floor by her security detail, and the rest of us were just sitting there thinking, what about us? What's going on? The Capitol Police start running back and forth to barricade or lock the doors to the House chamber, but they don't have the keys. So it's clear nobody had prepared for this. were asked to take out our gas masks, which are which are placed under the seats in the House chamber. So we do that. The House chaplain at one point stood up at the speaker's rostrum and began to read a prayer, which didn't exactly contribute to a sense of optimism about our situation. And then we got out, and most of us didn't really see what we have all now seen in those videos. We knew it was bad. We knew that the House, the Congress, the Capitol had been breached, but we didn't know just how awful it was. And my feeling at the time, I have to say more than anything else, was a sense of determination. I remember as we were evacuating the House chamber thinking, well, people are going to understand now what we've been talking about. That after this, after an event like this, there is going to be an end to denial of the problem of rising extremism in this country. We are going to turn from defense to offense. And I think I was right about that, because as you suggested, it was in a way, it was a tragedy, but it was also convenient to have on full display in front of the Capitol of the United States the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys, QAnon, the Three Percenters, the Oath Keepers, all of these people waving their flags and, let's be blunt, the Trump flag as well. All of these things coming together in an act of absolutely, I think, domestic terrorism aimed to not just intimidate, but really to overthrow the democratic procedures of government in our country. And so, yeah, we're on offense now. And I think the work that ADL has been doing and that many of us in Congress have been trying to do on this has been thrust to the front and center.
Congressman Torres, let me ask you the same question. Here you are, a new member of Congress. How did you deal with that shameful assault? How did you process it?
It was an overwhelming experience. You know, the experience of becoming a member of Congress is surreal on its own. And if you had said to me, Rabbi, that I would become a member of Congress during an infectious disease outbreak, that I would witness an insurrection against the US Capitol during the Electoral College vote count, and that I would then vote to impeach an outgoing president who had been impeached once before, and all of that would happen within the first 2 weeks of assuming office, I would have said that sounds dramatic enough to be a movie. So it's been the most disorienting and draining month that any freshman class has had to face, probably in the modern history of the United States Congress. I was not in the House gallery. I was in the Cannon office waiting, because we're prohibited from all appearing on the House gallery because of COVID rules, so we vote in cohorts. And as I was waiting in my office, the Capitol Police stormed inside, telling my staff and me to immediately evacuate because there were reports of bomb threats. And so for about an hour, I was wandering through the labyrinth of office buildings connected to the Capitol complex until the Capitol Police eventually found me and then brought me to a secure location, which then became a super spreading event. And the dominant emotion for me that day was not fear, but shock. It was reminiscent of the shock that I felt during 9/11. You know, during 9/11, my sense of invulnerability came crashing down. But I never could have imagined an attack on the Twin Towers. And then it happened. And similarly, I could have never imagined an attack on the US Capitol, one of the most guarded places on earth. And then it happened, and it happened so easily, and I'm still in a state of shock. And several of our colleagues are struggling with post-traumatic stress in the wake of the siege. The siege was an expression of extremism, and I see it not only as an attack on a physical structure, I see it as an attack on the very idea of America as a multiracial democracy. You know, for me, politics is an alternative to violence. Politics is the means by which we resolve our differences peacefully without resorting to violence. And when you cause your most fanatical followers to lose faith in the legitimacy of politics, as Donald Trump has done, then you're inviting them to engage in violence. And so there's a faction within our society that's willing to engage in extremist violence against elected officials in order to advance their political agenda. And this is dangerous territory in which we've entered.
Thank you, Congressman. Carmiel, I'm going to bring you into the conversation. The attacks of January 6th did not just happen out of nowhere. ADL has been following extremists and extremist-related events for decades. Can you contextualize what happened that day?
Absolutely. First of all, Scott and Rabbi Potasnik, I just want to thank you for including me in this discussion, and to thank both of the congressmen for sharing a Zoom screen and really for your leadership, past and future, on this issue. What happened on January 6th, and just hearing both of you talk about it in such a personal way, is really impactful, but also an important reminder that what is going on in this country today is personal. It's not just personal for the folks on the Hill, but it's personal for all of us and for all of us on this call. As Scott mentioned earlier, ADL has been tracking these trends through our Center on Extremism for decades. And what we have seen is a rise in extremism that effectively has multiple strains. And I want to look a little bit at some of the data that our center has compiled, because I think that really puts a fine point on exactly what it is that we are dealing with right now. Over the past 5 years, we have seen a deadly resurgence in white supremacy. 5,000 incidents of white supremacist propaganda were distributed in 2020 alone. That is nearly double the number of the previous year. 98% of extremist plots and attacks in the United States between 2011 and 2020 were carried out by right-wing extremists. 98%. 4 of the deadliest attacks in American history happened in the last 5 years. From Charlottesville to Charleston to Pittsburgh to El Paso, we are seeing the deadly consequences of white supremacist extremism play out all over this country right now. But there is a second thing that is happening that is perhaps more terrifying, and that is that ordinary people are becoming radicalized and spurred to action. This is a new breed of extremists that we have never seen before. They have been animated by their devotion to former President Donald Trump. They're living in an ecosphere of conspiracy theories, lies, and misinformation perpetuated on social media by folks like Alex Jones, QAnon, and other entities like Tom Malinowski named, like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and the 3%ers. They are being radicalized, mobilized, and brought together. And so we are now operating in a political and cultural backdrop where hate has proliferated and gone largely unchecked, particularly over the last 5 years. And so on January 6th, we saw the confluence of these trends. For folks at ADL who had been tracking these issues for decades, this strain of extremists that has gained in strength over the last 5 years and the trends that I mentioned earlier came together. What we saw at the Capitol was perhaps the most predictable terrorist attack in American history.
Thank you, Carmiel. As I listened to you, I think what was said to me by a member of that congregation in Pittsburgh, what had the tragic attack, he said, we used to say very often, never again. When we said never again, is it with a question mark at the end of it or an exclamation mark at the end of it? And I have to tell you, as long as we hear of these proliferation of these attacks, it seems that there's still a question mark, unfortunately. Congressman Torres, you're now the vice chair of Homeland Security Committee. That's something that's very important to you, that committee. You made a decision to pursue that before January 6th. Why? Why is it something that is so pressing for you?
Well, in fairness, I was appointed as vice chair after January 6th, so I don't want to give the impression. But there's no city in America that has greater stake in Homeland Security than New York. We've seen a surge in hate crimes, particularly in the Jewish community. The ADL reported back in 2019 that the level of hate crimes had risen to levels not seen since 1979, so a 40-year high in hate crimes. Obviously, we continue to be shaped by the searing experience of 9/11, which defines us as a city. And I'm concerned about the pattern of willful blindness to white supremacist extremism as a form of domestic terrorism. You know, the statistics are crystal clear that for decades, white supremacist extremism has been the dominant driver of domestic terrorism in the United States. But you would never know that judging by the priorities of the Department of Homeland Security. The Department of Homeland Security has been primarily focused on immigration enforcement to the exclusion of counterterrorism. And then even within counterterrorism, mostly focuses on jihadi violence rather than white supremacist violence. So it seems to me the allocation of resources in our society are based more on stereotypes rather than actual statistics, because the statistics are pretty clear that white supremacist extremism is the dominant driver. We saw it, the murder of African Americans in South Carolina, the murder of Jews in Pittsburgh, the murder of Latinos in El Paso. The siege on the Capitol was not an isolated event. It's part of a continuing pattern of white supremacist extremism, to which, in my opinion, the federal government has turned a blind eye.
Congressman Malinowski, I'm going to ask you about that because you are not new to this. You campaigned in the midst of a rise in QAnon conspiracy theories, and as far-right extremists were holding sway. And you led a resolution that alluded to the dangers that could unfold. Tell us about that effort and how you see this threat manifesting itself today.
Sure. Well, I've been concerned about this for quite some time, for all the reasons that you have been. And all of us saw the rise of QAnon over the last few years. And I think many of us saw in QAnon just a newfangled version of the old anti-Semitic blood libel conspiracy theory. It's basically the same deal, that there's this secret cabal of powerful people, many of whom just happen to be Jewish, who are controlling events behind our backs and stealing our children. And you know, that's been around for generations. And QAnon and social media together have spread that idea to millions of Americans who just don't understand its historical provenance. So I felt this was dangerous. I felt that QAnon was kind of like the gateway drug to terrorism, because once you are convinced by QAnon, once you take that little blue pill that tells you not to believe any legitimate source of information, not to trust the government, not to trust anybody, then you are susceptible to recruitment by groups that will actually call you to do things that are violent. So I thought it would be useful to try to get a resolution passed in the House that would be bipartisan. I didn't want it to just be Democrats. I wanted to put Republicans on the spot. So we got a totally balanced bipartisan resolution with 3 Republican members who were willing to stick their necks out. And when we got a vote, 17 Republican members voted against it, which was interesting. We know who they are, but the overwhelming majority voted with us to condemn QAnon. So that was the beginning. I never thought that just a condemnation was going to make this go away, but I thought it was a solid foundation for the real work that we would have to do going forward. And meanwhile, I was back home. I was getting attacked in a very contentious re-election campaign by an opponent who was supposedly kind of a respectable moderate Republican, but in fact was using QAnon imagery and attack lines against me as a way of mobilizing, I guess, a portion of his base that had been radicalized to that way of thinking. So it was very troubling that as we were doing this in the Congress, even in New Jersey, I came under attack from these extremists.
Congressman Torres, as I listen to Congressman Malinowski, I think to myself, these members of QAnon, some of them are fairly educated. We always thought that education is the answer, and we've learned over the years through history that education may make you smart, but not necessarily moral. And I'm just wondering, you campaigned, you saw the rise of QAnon, Proud Boys, and I talked to you, Jew to an African American, the person who hates you today hates me tomorrow, and vice versa. How did they impact you and people in your district?
Well, I mean, thankfully, I largely represent normal people, so there's no signs of white supremacist extremism in the South Bronx. But I have seen signs of white supremacist infiltration in law enforcement, in the military. 1 in 5 people arrested for reasons relating to the siege were members of the armed forces. Before I left in the city council, I was in charge of investigations, and I conducted an investigation into the New York City Police Department, and we were monitoring these online message boards, and we came to discover that one of the participants in the message boards, who was trafficking in the most vile forms of anti-Semitism and racism and homophobia, was actually the NYPD's anti-discrimination point person, the commanding officer for the Office of Equal Employment Opportunity. And when I asked the NYPD, do you have any policy or practice of monitoring social media for signs of extremism, the NYPD said no, it's beyond our bailiwick. So that's my concern, is that you have some of the most extremist elements in our society infiltrating police departments that then over police communities of color. And that's something that we have to aggressively root out.
Okay, so we clearly have a problem, with that backdrop and really the horrific events of January 6th, ADL stepped forward and we put forward the PROTECT plan to combat domestic extremism. And Carmiel, maybe you could talk a little bit about the PROTECT plan.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. Look, if anything's coming across here, it's really the scope and magnitude of this problem. And so ADL believes that there's no one way to get at it, no silver bullet, no single piece of legislation that is going to really appropriately tackle the myriad of threats that are coming into play. And so has put forward the PROTECT plan, a whole of government, whole of society approach to addressing domestic extremism. Now, ADL loves a good acronym, and so modeled similar to the Patriot Act, where every letter of the Patriot Act stood for a different action item, so too does PROTECT. It's a 7-point plan. Rather than take you through kind of each piece by piece, I'm going to give you sort of the broad strokes of what we're hoping to accomplish, and are working with lawmakers, including the gentleman on this call, to ensure that this is implemented, but not only working with members of Congress, but also at the state, local level, and also with the administration. We believe all three need to be working hand in hand together to drive forward a concerted approach. So let's start with kind of the big picture. We believe this threat needs to be prioritized, and we are demanding accountability for the very reasons that Congressman Torres started to talk about, which is that the last administration spent a great deal of time focusing on other threats that it deemed priority threats, like immigration issues and other efforts that were effectively targeting marginalized and minority communities. We want to see this administration prioritize this. We're calling for the formation of a 9/11 style commission, a White House summit. We want to see transparency about the extent of the problem and the supporting efforts to counter it, including bolstering reporting. So that's the first piece. The second, which Congressman Torres also touched on, is about resources. We believe that the government must dedicate informational, legal, and financial resources to deal with the threat holistically. And that includes a couple of different pieces. We're supporting the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, which would authorize offices within different agencies specifically dedicated to this and also require different reporting. We're calling for funding of efforts that prevent radicalization, like education, Holocaust education, and targeted violence and terrorism prevention grant programs, which Congressman Malinowski led in the last Congress. And I just got an email from his staff that he's planning on leading in this Congress as well. So thank you for that effort. We're also looking to fund an independent nonprofit center modeled after the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children that could help streamline national security tips and resources. We're opposing extremists from obtaining positions of influence in government. And this is at every level. It's at the level that Congressman Torres was talking about, in the police department, in the military, in task forces, but also influence within our government. ADL helped lead the effort to strip Marjorie Taylor Greene of her committee assignments. We believe that no one who is an adherent to a dangerous conspiracy theory should be in a position of power. We also want to hold social media companies accountable for their actions. They are profiting off of the proliferation of hate and extremism, and it needs to end. This is something that Congressman Malinowski has also been working on, and I hope we'll come to later in this conversation. And then finally, we're looking at targeting foreign white supremacist groups, because make no mistake, this is a transnational threat. We believe that this type of approach is what will have the most immediate and deeply significant impact, while at the same time protecting vulnerable communities from the potential of government overreach. And I'm happy to break into any of these different pieces in the Q&A, but I think I'll just leave the big picture here for now.
Carmiel, thank you. As you were speaking, I thought of an experience I had with my son. One day I walked into his room to borrow his globe, and I was walking away and he looked up, he says, "Dad, where are you going with my world?" And I think that's a question that all of us need to ask. And I am just so thankful that we have an ADL that makes us ask the question, where are we going? And we need to prioritize, our concerns if we are to go in a better direction. So, Congress people, Torres and Malinowski, you were there when ADL CEO Jonathan Greenblatt presented a Protect Plan. What elements do you see as your priority? What do you see there as something that we need to effectuate as soon as possible? Let's begin with Congressman Torres.
I think the plan that ADL has put forward reminds us of the complexity of the problem, and we have to examine the role that social media companies play in the facilitation of domestic terrorism. We have to examine the role that cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin play in the facilitation of domestic terrorism finance. On the question of social media companies, there's no question that social media has been an amplifier and a multiplier of disinformation that has radicalized people and has polarized our politics. And there's no question that it's been an enabler of communication and coordination among domestic terrorists who might otherwise operate as lone wolves, but who can easily cohere into a national or international network. The challenge is Section 230. Section 230 shields from liability tech companies whose platforms might unwittingly facilitate the spread and financing of domestic terrorism. Congress did legislate an exception to Section 230 for the purpose of combating child pornography. So the question is, should we legislate an exception to 230 for the purpose of combating domestic terrorism and promoting counterterrorism finance? I would be open to that. I would be supportive of that, because I think social media has been a driver of extremism in our society.
Thank you. Congressman Malinowski, maybe your views on the Protect Plan or any potential solutions to this domestic terrorism.
Sure. And first, I need to tell you all that our very distinguished colleague, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was just mentioned, has just moved to adjourn the House just to force us to go to the House, to stop what we're doing, go to the House floor, and to vote not to adjourn the House. This is the second day in a row that she's done this. I guess since we kicked her off her committees, she's got time on her hands. So at some point soon, I don't know, Ritchie, if you're there, but I'm probably going to need to log off for like a minute and then log back on my phone as I drive to the Capitol. But in answer to your question, I support all the elements of the plan that ADL put forward. I've worked on a number of them, as you mentioned, including trying to resource the Department of Homeland Security's programs appropriately. And Ritchie is right that they have not prioritized within those programs the right things in the past. We're going to make sure that they do. But I also want to focus on the issue that my colleague raised, because this is where I do have legislation that I think has gotten a lot of interest and attention. The social media companies are at the heart of the problem. What happened on January 6th, what was scary about it was that it wasn't one lone crazy gunman. It was thousands of people doing something totally deviant, but believing that what they were doing was completely normal. And that's a function of, number one, bad leadership, people, like the president telling them that it was normal, but also the fact that when they get online, which is where we all get our information, every single piece of information they were being fed by the Facebook algorithm and the Google and the Twitter algorithm was reinforcing the delusion that the election was stolen and that they needed to do something like march on the Capitol and hang Mike Pence. They use the same platforms as all of us on this call do, and yet they are seeing a completely different reality, because what the platforms do, and I would say it's not unwittingly, it is wittingly, it is the central design feature of the platform is to feed each and every person on the planet an individually tailored version of reality based on what they already believe, based on their pre-existing biases. And so if you're already biased towards QAnon, you're just going to get more and more and more of that kind of crazy stuff until you go off the deep end. And so I do think we need a targeted reform of Section 230. As Congressman Torres just suggested, that's what the legislation that I have would do to enable the platforms to be held accountable in court, to be forced to defend themselves in court, if their algorithmic promotion of content leads to an act of terrorism, a violent hate crime, very narrow set of terrible things, but enough where they would be incentivized to re-engineer their social networks so that they are not designed as they are today.
Right.
Thank you. We're going to go to questions in just a minute, maybe after this question. So if anybody has questions to put in the chat, feel free.
So, Congressman, what do you say to those listening on the webinar, to your constituents? Because people often say, well, what can one person do? What difference can I make? What would you say to them? Congressman Torres?
If you see something, say something. If you see genuine, we want to be careful not to criminalize people for holding political viewpoints that are different from yours, but if you see genuine signs of extremism, you should certainly report it, and the government should act on it. But ultimately, this is a failure of responsibility on the part of the government. The government has a role in protecting citizens from all forms of violence, including domestic terrorism. And in my opinion, we have fundamentally failed to do so.
Congressman Malinowski?
Just in terms of what people can do, your average citizen can do in the face of this.
Sorry, my screen was frozen for a second. So I can say, in my district, we've been talking about what's wrong, but I've seen a lot of what's right. I've seen a lot of individual members and leaders of our different faith communities come together to show that whatever their philosophical, ideological differences, whatever their cultural differences, they stand together in opposing hatred and violence. One of the most moving things that I've experienced since I was elected was seeing after the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, that the vigils and commemorations in my district were largely organized by our Muslim American community. And then not long thereafter, when we had the horrific massacre in Christchurch, New Zealand, it was the Jewish community that stepped up to organize the community gatherings. And that work has continued, and it's kind of like a vaccine against hate. You know, we build up our antibodies at the community level every time we come together like that. So when something like this happens, people know how to react, and they know that we're together. And I think, you know, Rabbi, as you said earlier on, we understand that, you know, if there's hatred directed at our neighbor, eventually it'll be directed at us, because we are all members of some group that somebody out there hates. And so I think at the individual level, that's what we need to do to support that kind of interfaith, intercommunal outreach.
Can I add one more thing? You know, also people can decide to no longer be part of social media platforms that aid in the spread and financing terrorism.
Hear, hear.
Mass of customers take a stand against these companies. They will have a financial incentive to finally do the right thing.
I've been tempted to get off Facebook. It's a little hard for an elected official not to communicate, right? But personally, I don't use it personally anymore.
And certainly ADL's Stop Hate for Profit Coalition has, which we've partnered with the NAACP and Color for Change and other organizations, has been all about that. We're going to move to questions now.
If I may, I'm just going to excuse myself for like 2 minutes.
Absolutely. And actually, I'm going to turn with the first question to Carmiel. So that'll give you a couple minutes to regroup. Carmiel, we're getting a number of questions in the chat about left-wing extremism. And, you know, I think we're all of the belief that hate is hate and extremism is extremism, and we're battling all forms of extremism as ADL has done for years. But can you relate a little bit to this idea of left-wing extremism?
Yeah, thank you. And forgive me, guys, because I'm having some tech issues. So can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, look, this is a question that comes up a lot, both from ADL members, but also in the conversations that we're having on the Hill. I think it's really important to remember that what we're dealing with today is not a Democratic threat or a Republican threat. This is a national threat. And it's one that we need to look at both in terms of the immediate threat at hand, but also in sort of the broader context of what's going on. ADL puts out an annual murder and extremism report. We released ours about a month ago. And in it, just in looking at the hard data, what we are seeing right now is that something like 75% of violent extremist plots and attacks just in the past year alone were carried out by right-wing extremists. And so because of that, that's where our focus is. This, to our mind, is the single most dangerous, tangible manifestation of hate, particularly against the Jewish community. And it is also the one on which the government has not been expending significant resources, as we noted earlier on in this conversation. And for that reason alone, we are hyper-focused on dealing with this threat. That's not to say that there's not elements of extremism that exist in both poles. But I think that what's happening is that it's becoming politicized and weaponized in a way that we don't deem effective. But ADL looks across the board dispassionately at the data. What are the hard facts in terms of what is happening? And the attacks that are being carried out that are having actual, that are killing people, that are concerted, that are hate motivated, are currently being carried out by white supremacists on the right. Again, we're tracking all of the data though. We're tracking data that includes any form of rioting, any form of violence, and just looking at the conclusions that we're reaching. And so that's really how we're thinking about left wing versus right wing. But I do think that it's important also to take a step back and to say, look, as we think through solutions to these problems, we have to ensure that they transcend this moment. Today's problem might be happening in the right wing, but who's to say that it's not going to be happening in the left in the future? And so we're making sure that any type of approach is looking at domestic terrorism dispassionately without a label attached to it.
Can I add on that?
Yeah, sure.
Because and Rabbi Potasnik can attest to this. There's no progressive elected official in New York City who's been more outspoken against anti-Semitism on the hard left than I have been. I've spoken out against the anti-Semitism of the BDS movement in no uncertain terms. So my record is crystal clear. Having said that, there is no one on the left who is remotely comparable to Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has denied 9/11 attacks, who threatened violence against the Speaker of the House, who has intimidated victims of gun violence. And there is no left-wing equivalent of the rioters who stormed the US Capitol in a violent attempt to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power. So I feel like you can speak out against the excesses of the hard left, as I have done in no uncertain terms, without falling into the trap of both sides. I believe, in my opinion, what I consider to be the fascistic right is a uniquely malevolent force in American politics, and the statistics demonstrate as much.
Yeah. I find sometimes people try to deflect, well, look at the left, and therefore, in a way saying maybe we should pay less attention to the right. And I think what you're saying is let's prioritize our attention. Let's focus where it matters most, but not ignore what's going on the other side.
And keep in mind, there were many liberal Democrats like myself who were outraged that George W. Bush and Donald Trump won the presidency while at the same time losing the popular vote. But we recognize that the Electoral College is the law of the land, and we accepted the outcome of the election. None of us ever thought of storming the US Capitol in a violent attempt at derailing the peaceful transfer of power. What was done on January 6th was unprecedented and unacceptable.
Thank you. Carmiel, we have a question about the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act. As an organization dedicated to social justice and civil rights issues, how does ADL deal with the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act?
Yeah, so let's take a step back and talk about what the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act is and what it is not. ADL and a number of organizations spent a great deal of time looking at whether or not it made sense to create a new criminal statute to address domestic terrorism. Ultimately, we came to the decision that there is no existing proposals around domestic terrorism statutes that would effectively address the concerns of the civil rights community, who has seen these laws historically used against them, the very marginalized communities that they are intended to protect, rather than to take on white supremacists and other violent extremists. And so with that in mind, ADL, at least right now, is not supporting a domestic terrorism criminal statute. We're working instead within existing authorities to support additional measures. So the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, which passed in the last Congress but not in the Senate, has been reintroduced now in the House and will soon be reintroduced by the Senate with a broad swath of Democratic support, including a coalition that ADL helped build over the last year of civil rights organizations and various different minority communities, would create offices, would effectively create designated offices within existing departments, DHS, FBI, DOJ, who are specifically dedicated to looking at the threat of domestic terrorism, and it would also create reporting requirements. So what this does is it forces government to actually look at this issue and take it seriously, and will give them the tools financially as well to do that. What it won't do is create a new criminal authority, and that's really what the civil rights community had been concerned about.
Maybe Congressman Torres, you want to relate to this? I mean, we talk a lot about ways to manage the situation, but protecting civil liberties is crucial in the process. I don't know if you have any particular views on that.
Yeah, first I question the need for a domestic terrorism statute. It seems to me the tools that we have are strong enough to crack down on domestic terrorism. And I wonder, and I have no settled view on this, but I wonder if we overstate the First Amendment concerns. You know, if you are a member of a violent enterprise, like a gang or the mafia, you could be prosecuted under the RICO statute. But if you're a member of a violent white supremacist enterprise, then all of a sudden you're protected by the First Amendment. And I feel like the federal government oddly refuses to treat violent white supremacist enterprises with the same heavy hand that it treats the mafia and gangs. And I never quite understood the distinction among them. So I feel like the federal government could more effectively use the tools that are presently available to clamp down on domestic terrorism.
I want to give Congressman Malinowski a chance to speak if you feel comfortable while you're driving. I don't know. I see you're on though.
Oh, I'm good.
Okay.
So I heard a couple of the answers, but not the question. I assume the question was about domestic terrorism statutes and whether we need new authorities.
Yeah, but also about how we preserve civil liberties. Not go too far in this legislation.
Yeah, I'm concerned about that. I was very much involved in the post 9/11 era in trying to roll back some of the mistakes that we made in allowing detention without trial and, of course, the torture detainees. And I'm angry. I'm absolutely determined that we go after these people, but I think we can do it without making those mistakes. I'm open to arguments that we need new authorities, but I agree for now with Congressman Torres. There are powerful tools that law enforcement has not yet used. I want to give the new administration a chance to show that it's going to prioritize the fight against domestic terrorism. I think we're going to see a lot from the new Justice Department. We are already seeing law enforcement play offense, and it's made such a difference. Look at the difference between January 6th and January 20th, the inauguration. January 6th, these people were confident. They marched on us. For 2 weeks, we marched on them. And they didn't do a darn thing on January 20th because they were busy trying to avoid being detected by the FBI. So let's give law enforcement a chance to use the tools that they have, and if in doing so we learn that we may need to enhance those tools, then we'll talk about that.
Thank you very much. And we're approaching the 1 o'clock hour, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. And I know you both, Congressman, need to get back to your duties. Just a couple minutes of concluding words from Hannah Sattler. Hannah is Assistant Director in the New York, New Jersey region, and she's going to close us out.
Thank you so much, Scott, and thank you, Representatives Malinowski and Torres, for taking time to speak with us today, and Carmiel and Rabbi Potasnik as well for joining this important conversation. As I mentioned at the top of the event, this is part of ADL New York, New Jersey's Take Action series, where we provide insight into ADL's work and have tangible action items for you to join our fight against hate. So today I will walk you through ADL's new online tool for reaching out to your respective representatives and letting them know that you support legislation that fights against extremism. So if you can follow along with me, we'll also put the directions in the chat. I'm just going to share my screen. So going to adl.org/protect-plan, you can learn more about the Protect Plan in depth. There's a nice video here as well that Carmiel had gone over all of this, but just to get more information. And when you click sign the petition, you get down to this form where you can put in all your information, and by putting in your zip code, it'll automatically send this email to your local rep. And you can, this is the text for the email that you can customize based off what you learned from today's conversation, and it will be sent automatically to the appropriate person. You can also share this petition on Twitter or Facebook. When you click the link, it automatically writes a tweet for you or a post. And if you're interested in being heard on any of the other issues that ADL works on, you can go to our Take Action, Be Heard in Congress, and all of our legislative priorities are listed here, and you can click Be Heard on any of these issues to send forms to your local representative. Again, all of these steps we will include in our follow-up email, but hopefully you all can just take a few seconds right now to submit this and be heard in Congress.
You.
So with that, I think that is all of our time right now. If you have any questions, feel free. My email again was in the chat to reach out to us. And thank you again to the representatives for joining us, Rabbi Potasnik, Carmiel, and Scott. Thank you all for taking the time for this really, really important discussion, and get back to the Capitol.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks all.